morning again. Good morning. So we are moving forward in the Gospel of John a bit to chapter 9 this morning. Now on the church calendar, this is Transfiguration Sunday. Do you remember the story of the Transfiguration? Right, Jesus takes some of his disciples and they go up to the top of a mountain and Elijah and Moses appear and God speaks and says, "This is my son, listen to him." And Jesus' appearance is transfigured and it's kind of the revealing of Jesus as the Son of God. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell that story. John doesn't. In fact, though, when you look at John, the whole book of John in some ways is kind of a transfiguration story because it's about the revealing of Jesus' identity and who he is. So we're going to look today at this story about the blind man, where it's clearly seeing who Jesus is or is not is kind of the point of the story. I need the remote. And I can't really see, so we're going to just, there we go. Alrighty. Alright, so in this story, Jesus proclaims who he is, both by action and by word. This sign that he does, healing the blind man, born blind, proclaims his identity. Jesus is the living water, and his spit turns this dirt into life-giving mud. But Jesus also in this passage proclaims himself to be both the light of the world and the Son of God. Now, there are a lot of characters in this story. As you saw, we had a whole bunch of people up here. And while the blind man is going to figure out who Jesus is, a lot of the other characters in the story are going to struggle with that. Most of them seek a way to shut down this revelation for one reason or another. And while all of us would like to think of ourselves as the blind man, the one who gets it, I think if we're honest, we have to admit that at different times, in different situations in our lives, we're really like most of these other people once in a while as well. So let's look at each of these groups of characters. First of all, you have the disciples, right? And the disciples want to focus on why this man was born blind. We do that too, don't we? We want a reason for why things happen. They focus on the reason behind it. They ask the wrong question. Why was this man born blind? They want to blame this man for his blindness. Now, and this was a typical worldview in the ancient world. And if we want to be honest, it's still in some circles a typical worldview now. Have you ever heard somebody say, something bad happened because somebody wasn't faithful enough or because they sinned? When I was doing my research this week, I was listening to a podcast, and one of the professors at Luther Seminary had cancer as a child. And he says he remembers somebody at church coming up to his mom and saying, well, he must have got cancer because she didn't feed the family properly. Right? Why we do this for a reason, though, don't we? We do this, I think, because if we can figure out a reason that you did something wrong and this bad thing happened to you, as long as I don't do that bad thing, then nothing bad's going to happen to me, right? And we think somehow that we can protect ourselves. But that's not true, is it? The world goes on and good things happen and bad things happen. And so we understand kind of where that question comes from. Now, when they ask this question, the way it reads in the New Revised Standard Version makes it sound like this man was born blind, that it almost makes it sound like God caused his blindness so that Jesus could cure him and proclaim God. But again, when you read that verse that says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, and then in the NRSV it says, but this man was born blind, he was born blind so that. Well, that he was born blind, that's not really in the Greek. It's this phrase that's been added to the NRSV. This is one of those cases where the King James actually gets it closer to what the Greek actually says. In the King James it says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But in order that the works of God might be revealed in him, we must work the works of him who sent me. So it's not about the cause of the blindness, but about the reason for healing. Jesus redirects them, and it says, this is not about why this man was born blind, but let's see what God can do with this situation. Let's see where God is going to go from here. The important thing isn't why he's blind, but that his healing will reveal God's presence and power. It provides an opportunity for God to be glorified. Again, as I said, we often want to find a reason for why bad things happen. But Jesus invites us here to, instead of trying to fix blame for the bad things that happen, to start where we are and to see what God can do with the situation. I shared about my cousin's son earlier during prayer time. And as I said, I don't believe that God caused Stephen's stroke, but I believe God can do something amazing out of that situation. What will God do now? What's God calling us to do to be a part of what God is doing? We don't want to miss out on what God can do with the situation. I think of our situation here at church, at First Baptist. I'm sure some of us are thinking as we move towards this decision about whether to sell the building or not and move in with another congregation, probably some of us have been thinking to ourselves, and it's natural, it's human, where did we go wrong? What could we have done differently? Why did this happen? Well, there may not be answers to those questions, and even if there are answers, those answers may not be overly helpful. But this is what we can do. We can say, okay, God, this is the situation we're in. Where are you going to take us? What are you going to do? What amazing things have you got in store for us? Help us to follow and to see those things. Next come the neighbors. And the neighbors don't even recognize this man, right? They say, is this the same guy? Which seems kind of weird, but this is the story we get, right? They've been living with this man, but something has changed about him. He can see now. He couldn't see before, and they're not even sure that it's really him. They basically kind of blow the whole situation off. They can't believe it's him. They can't see the miracle that's taking place in front of them. And sometimes we do that too. Things happen, and we blow it off as coincidence, or as just something that happened, or fate, when really it's God at work. How many times do we miss what God is doing because we're not looking for God to be active? We're not recognizing, like the neighbors didn't recognize the blind man, we're not recognizing God's activity in our lives and in the world around us. The next set of characters that we see in the story are the parents, and their fear overwhelms their ability to see what's happening. Their fear overwhelms their joy. Now, if the story did not say that the parents do this out of fear, I would argue that the parents actually give a very healthy response to the questioning by the Pharisees, right? They testify only to what they know firsthand. They say, yep, he's our son, he was born blind. They weren't there for the healing. They say, but we don't know exactly what happened. He may be blind, but he's an adult, he can speak for himself. They don't let the Pharisees triangulate them into the situation. However, the story specifically tells us that the reason that they do this is not because they are a really healthy family system, but because they have a fear of being put out of this community. They have a fear of change. They have a fear of what's going to happen if they speak out. You remember the saying, I'm sure we've all heard, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? And that can be true. Sometimes fear shuts us down. Fear holds us back. We can't see the future. We can't see exactly what's going to happen. And so we don't want to move forward. We become paralyzed with fear. What would have happened to this family, do you think, if they had stood up and testified to Jesus? Yeah, maybe they would have been put out of the synagogue, but perhaps they would have found a new community in those who were following Jesus. Sometimes, though, we do the same thing as well. And that fear of the unknown, that fear of change, that fear of what might happen can keep us from experiencing the joy of new opportunities and new possibilities. And then we have the Pharisees. And they kind of get the bad rap as the bad characters in the story. I don't know if you can read this. Can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Charlie Brown says to Snoopy, I hear you're writing a book on theology. I hope you have a good title. Snoopy says, I have the perfect title. Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong? The Pharisees don't believe the man's story because it goes against their preconceived ideas of what is supposed to be righteous and what is unrighteous. They actually don't believe because this story of Jesus healing this man blind from birth and on the Sabbath goes against what they believe about righteousness. There's a bumper sticker that someone mentioned this week that says, don't believe everything you think. Don't believe everything you think. You know, we are really good at this, at twisting reality to make it fit our preconceived beliefs. It's called cognitive dissonance, those little things that poke at our preconceived beliefs and our ability to put those aside when reality doesn't confirm our expectations. We reject facts when they don't confirm our long-held beliefs. But people, even in the face of evidence, can continue believing what they previously believed. There was a story I read, and you've probably heard this story, about a woman named Anna Anderson who died in 1984. She lived in Charlottesville, Virginia. And she claimed all of her adult life to be Anastasia Romanov, the youngest daughter of the last Russian Tsar. She was apparently pretty active in her community, and a lot of people knew her. But after her death, they actually did a DNA test to see if her claims were true. And it came back that no, she was not related to the Romanovs at all. But when they interviewed some of her neighbors, they didn't believe the DNA test. And they would talk about the reasons, not biological reasons, but social reasons, why the test must be wrong. Right? Even because they had this strongly held belief that that's who this was. And they couldn't face the reality. They couldn't change their belief system enough to accept that it was not, that what they believed was not true. These Pharisees set up these false dichotomies. They ask the wrong questions. They state that, well, either a person is from God and they observe the Sabbath, or they don't observe the Sabbath as we understand it, and that means they can't be from God, right? Or they say to the man later, well, either you give glory to God by calling Jesus a sinner, or you dishonor God by vouching for Jesus' righteousness. They set up these false dichotomies, and they can't see the truth. But we do this too. We set up false dichotomies. We set up false boundaries. We make unfortunate assumptions about facts and people that do not agree with us. I watched a TED Talk this week by Catherine Schultz. It was entitled On Being Wrong. Who likes to be wrong? We don't, and we'll go to a lot of effort to make sure that we're not. She said when we are confronted with facts or with people who believe differently than us, we make some unfortunate assumptions. She says the first thing we do is we make the ignorance assumption, right? Well, they just don't have all the facts. If I can give them the facts and then they will understand and they will come to believe as I believe. If that doesn't change the situation, then we go to the idiocy assumption. Well, they're just idiots. They have these facts and they still can't see the light. They just must be stupid, right? And what do you think the third one is after that? The evil assumption. Okay, they have the facts, they know the truth, and they just maliciously choose they have malicious intent. They have to undermine the truth. They just are choosing to go the wrong way. We can justify ourselves pretty strongly at the expense of others. The thing about the Pharisees is that they think they already know everything, and so they're not open to new options. Remember the saying, there is none so blind as those who will not see. And as we see with the Snoopy cartoon, being able to be open to new options requires humility. It requires a willingness to grow and to learn and to change. And again, we can be guilty of this. How many times do we have a plan and we're not going to let anything get in the way of that plan because it's a good plan? How many times are we sure that we know who God loves and who God doesn't love? How many times are we convinced that we know who's in and who's out? How often are we convinced that we know how to do church and it doesn't need to be done any differently because this is the way to do it? The problem is, like the Pharisees, we can miss God right at work in front of us because we refuse to give up our ideas about how things should be done. We miss God at work right in front of us because we aren't willing to let go of our ideas and look at what God is doing. And then we have the man born blind. This is the one person in the story who, over a period of time, seems to actually see who Jesus is and become his follower. This is the one who models a true disciple in this story. And it doesn't happen all at once, right? This man, it's a progressive journey for him. It's a story of who Jesus becomes for this man. First of all, Jesus is just someone he hears. He's blind when he first encounters Jesus. He can't see Jesus, but he hears him, and he does what Jesus asks him to do. After that, Jesus becomes to him one who has healed him, someone who has given him physical sight. When he's first questioned by the Pharisees, the first time, Jesus is a prophet. The second time that he's questioned, Jesus becomes for him one who is from God. And at the end of the story, when Jesus says to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" the man says, "Well, who is he? Tell me so that I can believe in him." And Jesus says, "I'm he. I'm the Son of Man." And what's the man's response? "Lord, I believe." He has made this journey from one who hears Jesus to one who confesses and professes Jesus. Faith is a journey of trust. The man is simply there at the beginning, but responds to Jesus' command. He has a willingness to go further, to continue to seek. And he doesn't proclaim faith until the very end. Our faith is a journey as well. It's not like that day we say, "Yes, Jesus, I want to follow you," and we decide we're going to get baptized, that we have it all figured out. It's a lifelong journey. At some point, our responsiveness to Christ becomes faith. Our encounter with Christ becomes trust and belief. Now, sin in the Gospel of John is a state of not being in relationship with Jesus. Sin in John is not about doing something wrong, but it's about relationship. It's about being in relationship with Jesus. And here, this man is given an opportunity to come into relationship with Jesus. And he does, right? At the end of the story, he recognizes Jesus and he's in relationship with him. But along the way, he tells the truth. He testifies to the grace he has received. Sometimes we think that we have to be apologists for the faith, that we have to know all the theology, and we have to know how to explain everything and have all the answers. But sometimes we can't, and we don't. Not sometimes. All the time. We can't. We can't have all the answers. We can't know all the little pieces of theology, but what can we do? We can share our experience with Jesus. We can share what Christ has done in our lives. Sometimes we can't explain, but we can tell our story. We can share the before and the after. We can say, I once was blind, but now I see. He gave me sight. This story moves us as the reader toward a greater insight. As the blind man appears and reappears in the story, his witness moves forward toward greater and greater understanding of Jesus' identity, and therefore greater and greater sight. The irony in this story is that the blind man is brought to sight, and the Pharisees are left blind. The Pharisees choose to remain in their blindness. And that word is one you've seen before. That word for remain is the same word for abide. Remember, we've heard that several times already, and we'll continue to hear it throughout the Gospel of John. The Greek word meno. That's the same word. They choose to remain, to abide, to stay in their blindness. They choose to stay out of relationship with Jesus. And if you remember from last week, no, week before last, when we were looking at John 3, and Jesus was talking to Nicodemus, Jesus says at the end of that passage, the light has come into the world, and who's the light? Jesus, right? And people loved darkness rather than light. The real blind are those who refuse to see. But we can be brought to sight when we're willing to consider that we might be wrong. When we look for what God is doing, and when we relinquish our fear. Discipleship isn't about explaining Jesus, but about living with, in relationship to, and testifying to Jesus. The man can't explain it, but he testifies. He confesses his experience with Jesus. He gives his confession. And discipleship is about that, about relationship and living, not about rules and regulations. Sometimes I think we overthink our faith. Now, I am all for thinking in logic. I'm not one of these people who believes that our faith is just supposed to be some pie in the sky, trust whatever the preacher says, da-da-da-da. I think as Baptists, this is very Baptist, that we are called to study, that we are called to discern our faith, that we are called to use the brains that God gave us. And my personality lives that out. I am one who likes to have the facts, and I want to know what's going on, and I want to have a plan, right? But sometimes we have to not overthink things. Sometimes we have to let that conversion, that transformation, that change that Jesus is making in our lives simply be without trying to explain it. Because the truth is that our conversion, our transformation is messy. In this story, it takes place with mud and spit. That's pretty messy. And most of our lives are pretty messy. And our conversion stories don't often sound all that convincing to other people. Just because you had a holy moment with mud does not mean that the rest of us are going to stop scraping it off the bottom of our boots, right? That's from Anna Carter Florence. But we need to focus on what we can actually describe. The difference between before and after. All I know is that I was blind, and now I can see. We confess Jesus, not explain him. So what is Jesus doing in your life? What is Jesus doing in this congregation? Where do you see God at work? Where do you see Christ bringing healing, bringing change, bringing transformation? We are getting ready to make some big decisions as a congregation. We are getting ready, one way or the other, to go on a journey of faith. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is to let go of trying to figure out the reasons, to focus on the possibility of the miracle of what God might do among us here and now. We can refuse to see. We can refuse to change. But if we do, we're going to miss out on the miracle. Let's pray. God, help us be like the blind man, which may seem like a weird thing to say because, God, we don't want to be blind, but we want to go on this man's journey. We want to move from blindness to seeing you, the light of the world, to sight and understanding, to confession and witness and testimony and following wherever you lead us. God, shut down those things in us that would keep us from taking part in the marvelous miracles that you have in store for us. Help us to not be afraid. Help us to not write off your work in front of us as just a coincidence or just something that happens. Help us to show those places, show us those places, God, where we need to let go of our preconceived ideas of how things are supposed to be, so that we can be where you are. Help us to see, God, and help us to follow.